In this session, we'll be exploring the theme of contact. By that I mean the coming into contact of various cultures throughout history. Instead of starting out with the big ideas as we have in the first few sessions, let's instead begin with a specific work to help us get there. Here's a spectacular work by the Ethiopian painter Julie Maratu. It's a massive painting, more of a mural really. It's 9 by 12 feet. Maratu tends to work with maps, diagrams, architectural schematics, and abstract forms that she projects onto the blank canvas while working. In the case of this painting, Stadia 2, which is part of a series of 3 paintings from 2004, she worked with the visual designs of sports stadiums in 3 different countries: the United Kingdom, Australia, and the United States. Already here we see points of contact between different places. Maratu was born in Ethiopia, has lived and studied in Michigan, Rhode Island, Dakar, Senegal, and now resides in New York City. She's described her paintings as having speed and sound, and in an interview she says she listens to lots of different music while painting, from Ethiopian music to jazz to hip-hop. From all these details, we already get a sense of the global aspects of the artist and her work, and what the post-colonial theorist Homi Bhabha calls hybridity. Hybridity is the fluid in-between space of fixed cultural identities and exchanges. It's what comes out of 2 or more cultural meeting points. And in this sense, aren't we all hybrid in some way, shape, or form? It's often said that Maratu's paintings are like maps, but not the 2-dimensional maps we're used to and have so long used to visualize the globe. They're more like 3-dimensional mappings, or mappings with even more dimensions than this, which try to encompass the many layers of interactivity of our present-day world. Just think of the internet alone. A map of cyberspace couldn't really be rendered as a 2-dimensional space. It's more like a big multi-dimensional neural network with innumerable amounts of connections and shapes. In the specific case of this painting, Studia 2, it's as if all these different flags, team logos, brand logos, and other symbols from visual culture have exploded in one big swirling confetti bomb, which at the same time seems to be entering into some sort of vortex or hurricane-like movement. It's a really fast painting, especially at its bottom half. And just think of the ways major sports teams today involve so many different connections. Corporate and state sponsors from the US and abroad. The players themselves come from so many different places, and so do the owners of the teams, and of course, so do the fans. And there's a word for this: globalization. In fact, Maratu's paintings are often talked about in connection with this term, that they visualize the process of globalization in their complex, multi-dimensional mappings. Globalization is a term that came into prominence in the 1990s, especially after the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union. It was thought that history had come to an end, and that now the whole world was connected in one big marketplace of ideas and products. In other words, that planet Earth and all its cultures had become one, connected and interconnected. This was claimed with a lot of optimism at the time, and indeed there are some good things that have come out of a globalized world. But it's easy to see the darker side of globalization, especially the political and economic realities of certain places in the world coming under control of the forces of globalization, maybe even becoming exploited by these political and economic forces. Globalization and all the world's cultures coming into contact with one another could only happen once, and arguably once it happened, it's irreversible. The global cat is out of the bag. But did this process really start in the 1990s, or even in the 20th century? Can't we study the past as various moments along the way of globalization? Well, this is the question that's going to guide us today in this session on our theme of contact. What you're seeing is the Parthenon, the most celebrated temple from 5th century classical Greece. It was built on the Acropolis in Athens. Acropolis simply means the highest city, by the architects Callicrates and Iktinos. Art historians and archaeologists still marvel at this structure, and it still dominates the skyline of the city today. First off, it's all marble, many tons of it, which had to be quarried and transported to Athens from some 10 miles away, all without modern machinery or transport. It's 228 feet long and 101 feet wide. The Greeks were mad about proportion, harmony, and symmetry, which means nearly all the measurements of this building fit a specific ratio, 9:4. So, for example, the different lengths of the 2 rows of columns on the long side and the 2 rows of columns on the wide side of the temple match this ratio. For the Greeks, geometry was not simply something to measure with. They thought the very cosmos was ordered by it. And in fact, Pythagoras, who first discovered the ratios of sound waves in music, thought these harmonies ordered the universe. In this way, the Parthenon was a mirror of the divine Greek cosmos. Still today, we don't even know how Callicrates and Iktinos were able to get the measurements of the marble so exact. So, for example, each column on the sides of the temple are assembled from several separate cylinders of stone cut to fit so exactly that they almost rival in precision our modern architectural techniques. But the other remarkable thing to notice is that despite this obsession with symmetry and ratio, there are a number of ways the Parthenon was refined and tweaked. It's often been said that this temple has no right angles. So in other words, it has no 90-degree angles. For example, the entablature, which is the horizontal part of the building of the temple running on top of the columns, buoys upward as you move to the center. It's not perfectly parallel to the ground. The columns themselves are all different thicknesses depending on their placement around the perimeter of the structure. Why is this? Well, it's been much debated, but it's often argued that these are adjustments made for visual effect. If the entablature were perfectly straight and parallel to the ground, it would actually look like it's sagging in the middle. If the columns were exactly the same thickness, their thickness would actually look a bit different from each other. We should also take into account the perceptual effects of viewing this massive marble structure as a small human body looking up at it, which has its own optical effects. And so, to make this temple look perfect and harmonious, Callicrates and Iktinos adjusted the physical dimensions in order to make the perception of this temple in our heads look just right. This is amazing if you think about it, and it's an interpretation that aligns with the ideas of the most celebrated philosopher of this period, Plato, who thought that truth didn't reside in physical objects, but in ideal forms or concepts, which can only be reached with our minds. So, why are we looking at this most famous classical Greek temple in this session, focusing on different points of contact with other peoples? Well, there's the fact that the laborers who made this temple possible in such a short amount of time, a mere 11 years, were not only Athenians but also slaves and foreign workers. The building's labor force already amounts to a mixing of different peoples from different parts in the Mediterranean. But to really answer this question, we need to have a clear picture of the political backdrop of this period in classical Greece, especially the history of warfare. You see, the splendor of Athens, its Acropolis, which includes other amazing temples and sacred sites in addition to the Parthenon, was a direct result of the Greco-Persian Wars. Let's get a quick sense of this military history. In 480 to 79 before the Common Era, the Greeks had a decisive victory over the Persian Empire, which was located in modern-day Turkey, Afghanistan, and Iran. An important battle happened at the town of Marathon in 480, which is actually how we get the term marathon today, since there's a legend of a young Greek soldier named Philippides, who ran 26.2 miles without stopping from Marathon back to Athens to announce their victory, only then to promptly keel over dead. In reality, the decisive victory only came a year later at Salamis and Plataea. This success in war led to the subsequent monumental building program in Athens, including the Parthenon, which was initiated by the most important political leader of the time, Pericles. The Persians were actually defeated by a whole coalition of Greek city-states, not just Athens, but Pericles was astute and probably corrupt enough to make sure that it would be Athens who profited the most from the victory over the Persian Empire. So now, this is where things get really interesting. It's not just that Athens built all these amazing temples to their gods as a way of giving praise. They did, but they also inscribed different references to the Greco-Persian Wars directly onto their temples, sculptures, and monuments. The Parthenon is a perfect example. We're going to take a look at two different sections, the Metaphase and the pediments. First, take a look at these two diagrams to know what these architectural elements are. The Metaphase run along the entablature just above the columns that go around the outside of the temple. They're squares with relief sculptures on them. Relief sculpture is a type of sculpture that's attached to a building. The pediments are on the shorter end of the temple. They're long triangle-shaped and also often have sculptures on them. We no longer have the pediment sculptures intact, but art historians have taken those that are left and tried to recreate what they might have looked like. Here is the east pediment of the Parthenon, which would have fit in that triangular shape, which features Greek gods and mythological stories. One of them is the founding story of Athens. And the story goes that there was a vote for the patron god of the city. The vote was between Athena and Poseidon. The vote went down the middle, with men voting for Poseidon and women voting for Athena. Since there were more women than men, Athena won the vote. And this greatly angered Poseidon, who promptly threatened to flood the whole place. In order to appease him, the now Athenian men struck a bargain with the sea god. They stripped the women of their Athenian citizenship, which meant that, like foreigners and slaves, they were unable to vote and could not pass their names along to their children. So what we have on this pediment is not only the founding story of Athens, but also an example of us versus them thinking. Specifically, the Athenian men considering themselves more important and superior to women, along with foreigners and slaves. Athens was an early democracy, but I think you can tell it was a selective democracy. Now, this us versus them thinking can also be found on the Metaphase, which even more clearly reference the Greco-Persian Wars. One group of Metaphase shows a mythical battle between the Lapiths, who were a mythical race of Greek men, and centaurs, who were mythical creatures with human upper bodies and horse lower bodies. While this recalls a mythical battle in the past, everyone in Athens would have understood that these Metaphase also referenced the wars that they had just fought, which means that the centaurs doubled as Persians. Sometimes the centaurs/Persians looked like they were getting the upper hand in these Metaphase. The Greeks liked to depict their enemies as formidable. And sometimes it was the Lapiths/Greeks who were getting the upper hand, as in this specific Metaphase you're seeing, where the muscular Greek soldier, the Lapith, is grabbing the neck of a centaur/Persian, as if about to cut off the head. The Greeks considered the Persians to be uncivilized and uncultured barbarians. They thought the same thing about women, who they considered untamable. The word barbarian itself comes from this moment in history. When the Greeks heard the Persians speaking, they thought it was just gibberish, and they mocked it as just bar, 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 bar. This is actually how we get the word barbarian. And so both the centaurs on the Metaphase and the word barbarian gets us to an important point about contact between different peoples in history. What can often enter the equation are stereotypes and biases. In other words, the projecting of certain ideas and perceptions that are actually distortions or falsehoods. This is definitely happening here. The Persians were deemed to be barbaric, uncivilized, wild, bestial, with a voracious appetite for war and conquering. Was this really what the Persian civilization was like? No, but it was the way the Greeks pictured the foreigner to themselves. And often these type of projections onto other people that look or seem different is a way of reinforcing one's superior self-conception. So for example, if they are uncivilized, then we must be civilized. This is a major us versus them moment in history. Some scholars even argue that this is when the division between the West and the non-West first came into being. And there are two important terms I'd like you to learn that have to do with these sort of stereotypes and false projections. The first is Orientalism. This is a word coined by the post-colonial thinker Edward Said to encompass all the ways that Europeans have projected their biases and skewed perceptions of non-Western peoples, especially those in present-day North Africa and the Middle East. Here's an example from the 19th century, much more recent, a painting by Jean-Léon Gérôme depicting not a real scene, but a fantastical setting of various non-Western locations and peoples. We see a naked young man standing in front of a group of older men playing music to the boy's Snake Charming. Almost all the Orientalist features are here. The non-Western is pictured as dressed shabbily or not dressed at all, in other words, uncivilized and uncultivated. There are associations with beasts like the python. And there's an erotic tinge to the painting that renders the non-Western body either effeminate or homoerotic, which often lent them false associations of weakness or decadence. Does this painting really represent a real place in Northern Africa? Of course not. And in 1870, much of Africa was already under European colonial rule. This painting also reminds us, this painting often reminds me of the old Indiana Jones movies and the cringy ways they depicted other cultures, especially that second one. Another term I'd like you to know is primitivism. Primitivism is the idea that other cultures are backwards, closer to nature, or maybe even further back in time. We see this in Paul Gauguin's work, another 19th century French painter who not only depicted non-Western cultures in his paintings, but even went to Tahiti and other supposedly quote-unquote exotic places in order to live like a native, in other words, like a quote-unquote primitive. In this case, he was escaping Europe and what he considered to be an oppressive Western civilization. So sometimes in primitivist works like this, and in some Orientalist works, the non-Western is deemed to be superior in certain ways, or at least is deemed to be a remedy or a form of escape. But we shouldn't forget that this is grounded in an imaginary projection. Once more, the truth on the ground was very different. Not only was Tahiti not an uncivilized place, but once Gauguin got there, it was already a French colony. So once again, this us versus them dynamic is partly founded on myth and misunderstanding, sometimes wishful misunderstanding. Okay, let's go back to the 5th century ancient Greece just for a moment. The Greco-Persian Wars do not represent the only cultural contacts at the time. Far from it. One of the earliest global trade routes was being developed, which around the time of the Parthenon already connected the Persian Empire with the landmass of Asia, notably present-day China. This was the famous Silk Road, which in fact wasn't just a road but many different land and sea routes that by the 8th century of the Common Era reached from Japan to South Asia to Africa and to Rome and so much else in between. Although it's named after a fabric that's woven by little worms, which became lucrative during the Han Dynasty in China as an export, the Silk Road saw many different commodities being exchanged, most notably spices, that only grew in certain areas of South Asia, like cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg. So already you can notice that this route was not only about economic exchange, it was also about an exchange of different tastes and culinary approaches. I guess it's second nature for us to have multicultural options at the supermarket, but try to imagine a time when chocolate, tea, coffee, cinnamon, and so much else were not yet part of the Western diet. The Silk Road was as much a cultural melting pot as it was an exchange of goods, spiritual and religious ideas, philosophy, different forms of music, different languages and dialects, different fabrics and fashions, and of course, yes, different ways of making art objects. Here's a really well-known pottery statue that attests to the cultural melting pot that was the Silk Road. It was found in 1957 in an excavated tomb of a military officer from the Chinese Tang Dynasty. Thanks to these trade routes, the Tang Dynasty, which lasted from 618 to 906, the Common Era, was one of the largest and wealthiest places in the world. It was also highly diverse. The capital city of Chang'an was home to Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, Christianity, Manichaeanism, and other world faiths. Without this safekeeping in this burial ground, I don't think this just over 2.5-inch tall statue would have come down to us in such incredible condition. The colors are still pretty vibrant, especially the clothing on the figures and the saddle/rug that they're sitting on. Although it's hard to see all of them in this photograph, there are 5 musicians, one of which holds a stringed instrument called a pipa, a Japanese instrument that the Tang Dynasty was especially fond of. The musicians themselves seem to be cosmopolitan, that is, coming from different places. 2 are Chinese, but the other 3 come from Central Asia. We also know what species the camel they're riding on. It's a Bactrian camel, which is native to Central Asia. This one seems especially happy. His head is tilted back, maybe with a slight smile as if he's enjoying the music coming from behind him. This is well before automobiles, And in fact, camels were the primary mode of transport on the Silk Road. And just imagine the importance of animal power in history before the invention of the steam engine. It's not surprising that we still describe cars as having horsepower. So not only do we have an example of a ceramic here, which was also a primary good that traveled along the Silk Road, but we have big clues as to the material cultures that would have spread and blended along this route. Animals, clothing, instruments, musical styles, and humans with different customs and languages all traveling together. And here's another example of a ceramic that would have traveled along the Silk Road. One of the great technical innovations of China is porcelain. Porcelain is a smooth ceramic made of kaolin clay that's fired at seriously high temperatures. And yet this elegant plate, which was made sometime during the 10th and 12th centuries, comes from Khorasan, which is in present-day Iran. So this is a hybrid object. Hybrid in the sense that it fuses two different cultures in one object. We have a Chinese ceramic technique, porcelain, and a type of Arabic calligraphy that we've seen before, Kufic script, which has been elongated to fit quite nicely on the lip of this plate. This is one of several white pottery plates that were unearthed in the 1930s and 40s, each of which containing a different Arabic proverb. This one translates to, quote, "Knowledge, the beginning of it is bitter to taste, but the end is sweeter than honey." I sort of like the idea of a plate telling its eater that gaining knowledge, while it might be hard to ingest, in the end is more satisfying than the sweetest of foods. One of the key connecting cities with the Tang Dynasty and the major stopping points along the Silk Road in East Asia was Constantinople, which was an even bigger city than Chang'an at the time. The last time we stopped in Constantinople, it had just been founded by the newly Christianized Roman Emperor Constantine in 324 Common Era. This time we meet the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, who was responsible for one of the most amazing churches ever built, the Hagia Sophia, or the Church of Holy Wisdom. The story goes that a chariot race caused a riot, the Nicaea riots, that almost destroyed the whole city and nearly dethroned Emperor Justinian. After holding firm at the suggestion of the Empress Theodora, the emperor undertook this huge building project. Instead of architects, he decided to enlist a mathematician, Anthemius of Tralles, and a physicist, Isidorus of Miletus. The idea behind this decision was that these were more abstract-minded thinkers who wouldn't be limited by the architectural and engineering limits of the time. And wow, did they come up with something spectacular. Here it is from the outside. It's a hybrid between a central planned church with a dome, like the Pantheon we looked at last session, and a basilica planned church, which is longer than it is wide. We'll revisit this type of church when we study those amazing Gothic cathedrals in France a little later. You can see from the outside that the building is made up of several intersecting domes and arches, 4 of which support the central dome. But it's not until you step inside that you see what made everyone back then, and still today, gasp in wonder. The dome seems to be suspended in the air, miraculously and weightlessly. Of course, we know the 4 arches, which are actually called pendentives, support the dome, but they do so in a way that makes their support seem invisible or off to the side. Then there are those audacious windows that run along the bottom of the dome. On a sunny day, rays of light stream through them, giving the effect of a holy ring of luminescent support. Again, as if the dome of the church is floating on light itself, miraculously. Very few people knew how this mathematician and physicist pulled this off. Most everyday people would have thought that there was a divine power at work, like angels holding up the dome. And it's always good to try to get an idea and to enter into the mind of someone living far in the past, who wouldn't have had an understanding of the natural laws, and even the leading thinkers at the time wouldn't yet have discovered gravity. Add to all this the golden decorations and icon paintings and mosaics, and the whole place would have bathed you in this divine glow. It would also have been illuminated by natural lighting, like candles, which would have created a flickering effect that even made the images seem to move or pulsate with life. In short, this church would have appeared to be a living and holy embodiment of the Christian God. It wouldn't stay that way for long, however, and this is where our theme for this session comes in. In fact, the city of Constantinople, and even before when it was known as the city of Byzantium, would have changed hands many times over. In 1453, the city would fall to the Islamic Ottoman Empire, and the Hagia Sophia was turned into a mosque. You may have noticed the minarets from the outside image, which were added around this time. Minarets are a key part of Islamic architecture. They're towers that are often used for the call to prayer. You may also have noticed from the photographs from the inside those large calligraphic medallions with Arabic script. These were added in the 19th century, and lists of names of holy figures in Islam, including the Prophet Muhammad. In 1935, the first Turkish president sought to transform the country into a secular state and turn the mosque into a museum, which it remained until just last year when the current president of Turkey turned it back into a mosque. If you really study the history of the Hagia Sophia from the 6th century up to the present, it's a dizzying amount of decisions and meetings of different cultures and worldviews. And this also presents a real challenge to art historians and those in charge of maintaining the building. Over the centuries, Christian mosaics were plastered over and covered with Islamic art. And like an onion, in order to get to one layer, you need to peel the one that comes before it, effectively destroying that previous layer. In many ways, this building represents the crisscrossing of different histories and cultures that are inextricably bound with one another in this really complex way. The Hagia Sophia is an amazing building, but it's neither the first nor the last structure that embodied such different histories and cultures. We can travel backward again from the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire to the Roman Empire well before it was Christianized to see another example of this. This is the Arch of Titus, an example of a triumphal arch, a key architectural innovation of the Roman Empire. You may have seen one of these before, and one of the most well-known is the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, which was just wrapped in fabric as the last public artwork by the French artists Christo and Jean-Claude. A triumphal arch is made of a Roman arch, which is an inverted U-shaped design, and it often has sculptures on it as well as writing. The arches exude political power, which is why they were often placed at the entrance of cities or important sites. This one was made for the Emperor Titus, who was only in power for 2 years, from 79 to 81 Common Era. It's said he died of a fever. His younger brother Domitian became emperor and built this arch in his older brother's honor, who, remember, had become a god after death. In fact, the Arch of Titus commemorates this deification, his becoming a god. This arch also depicts another story. If you walk through the center tunnel of the structure, to one side you'll see this sculptural scene. That's Titus himself, coming back from battle on his horse-driven chariot with his soldiers. It's kind of hard to see, but the winged personification of victory stands just behind the emperor and crowns him. Titus is doing exactly what these type of triumphal arches were designed for, celebrating victory when coming back to Rome from a war campaign. And in fact, this was an actual historical event. If you turn and look to the other side of the tunnel, you'll see this sculptural scene. These are Titus's soldiers carrying the spoils of war. And it's a giveaway for what war this was. The Jewish wars, where Rome sacked and plundered the Second Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. The spoils of war would often have been paraded around the streets of Rome. And in this sculptural scene, we can see the sacred Jewish candelabrum that was taken from the temple, known as the menorah. So what this triumphal arch commemorates is not only Titus's deification, but also a concrete meeting point between two cultures and religions. After all, at this time, the Roman Empire occupied ancient Palestine, where Jerusalem was located, and the Second Temple of Solomon. We now turn to some later forms of occupation and some of the most consequential and harmful forms of settler colonialism in history. I give you 2 examples, one from the so-called New World that Christopher Columbus thought he had discovered. He thought he had discovered a more direct route to India, which he didn't, and in fact the so-called New World had already been discovered by the many civilizations already inhabiting North, Central, and South America, including the Aztecs that we learned about last session. The other comes from Africa and the history of its colonization at the hands of European powers. In both cases, what the Europeans thought they were doing was spreading civilization. It was even called a quote-unquote civilizing mission, which usually meant the spread of Christianity. Once more, we're finding that stereotyping us versus them mentality of the supposedly civilized and the uncivilized. But it also meant having access to the natural resources and labor power of faraway places and peoples, which many scholars argue became the basis and engine for the capitalist economy as we know today. Lastly, it features one of the worst crimes against humanity in history, the slave trade. This is a ceiling painting from the Baroque period in Europe. An essential part of the Baroque aesthetic was to overwhelm the viewer, and this was done in two reinforcing ways. One, artists would use lots of different mediums together: painting, sculpture, architecture, design, even music. This would create an all-encompassing effect. Two, the work of art would often enter into your personal space. It would come out at you, invite you in, and generally try to have you lose sense of where you end and it begins. In other words, Baroque art was immersive, even bodily. This wasn't just for visual effect, though. This was a time of religious wars in Europe, which began with the Protestant Reformation in 1517, when Martin Luther posted his famous 95 Theses on the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral in modern-day Germany, where he demanded changes to the Catholic Church. This would lead to a split in the Church between Catholics in Southern Europe and Protestants in Northern Europe. In order to combat this Reformation, this Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church enacted a counter-Reformation, which used art, design, and architecture to keep the people on their side with these very seductive and immersive forms of art I've just described. The painting you're seeing here is by Giovanni Battista Gauli, and it's a perfect encapsulation of the Southern Baroque style and the Catholic Counter-Reformation. You're actually looking up at the ceiling, and as is so often the case with ceiling paintings like this, it's hard to get a sense of where the painting begins and ends, and where the building itself begins and ends. The architecture, sculpture, gilded designs, and painting seem to blur into each other. Bodies seem to fall from the ceiling, and you as the viewer feels like you're being sucked up into the air. It's kind of hard to get a sense of this from just a photograph, but I can tell you that being in this church and looking up really does create this effect. You get a sense that the top of the church has been cut open, revealing a portal to heaven. The center of the composition is a blinding white light. Clouds and angels gravitate upwards towards this light. And if you look closely, in the dead center, there's a floating cross, along with a monograph of Jesus and the insignia of the Jesuits. Keep the Jesuits in mind. We're going to come back to them in just a second. This is a judgment scene that we've seen before, which means not everyone is saved. If we move to the bottom end of the painting, we see all these writhing, diseased bodies in great pain. Unlike the blonde-headed angels and other figures who seem to be lifting up towards the center and the cross, these figures are falling out of the sky and off to the side. They're the damned. They're those who have been judged unworthy of salvation. They're on their way down to hell. This is a story that impels the public to remain pious through the glorious imagining of heaven and the fear-inducing imagining of damnation. But there's something deeper going on here. There's something else going on here. At this moment in history, and actually even beginning a century earlier in the 16th century, Europe was already exploring the world and colonizing non-European peoples, including in parts of Asia, Africa, and North, Central, and South America. This is where we get back to that idea of the quote-unquote civilizing the non-European. And this meant people with different skin pigmentation, customs, and worldviews that were considered pagan, even evil, and in need of Christian redemption. And notice the writhing bodies that are damned, or in need of salvation on this ceiling. Their bodies are distinctly not white. Instead, they're various shades of yellow, red, and brown, which means this painting is making a visual connection between sinfulness and racial difference. Again, like the history we traced at the beginning of this session between the Greeks and the Persians, we're finding a similar dynamic here centuries later of a quote-unquote civilized us and a quote-unquote barbaric them. The Jesuits were a big part of this history of colonization. The conquering of other cultures often went hand in hand with attempts to convert them to European religion and customs. In fact, the founder of the Jesuits was St. Ignatius of Loyola, who was the one who conceived this very church and the ceiling in Rome that you're seeing. So the splendor of this Baroque painting by Gaudi is connected to the history of European colonization. And part of this quote-unquote civilizing mission involved destroying works of art, records, books, and other material culture. Again, because they were considered pagan or evil or unchristian. This happened in Mesoamerica and the Aztec people of Tenochtitlan. Of course, European invaders did much more than simply destroy works of culture. The sad history of settler colonialism is one of unimaginable violence, where conquistadors and their armies killed whole indigenous populations. And one of the biggest reasons for what can only be described as ethnocide and genocide are the diseases brought over unwittingly by the Europeans. This was largely due to the domesticated animals brought over, especially cattle, that carried zoonotic viruses. Since Europeans were used to living with these domesticated animals, they were immune. But since the indigenous populations were not used to these animals, and therefore were not immune to these deadly zoonotic diseases, they died by the millions. In fact, Hernán Cortés, the Spanish conquistador who conquered the city of Tenochtitlan and the Aztecs, was himself a wealthy rancher back in Spain. New books were created after the conquest, however, and here's one of the most important, the Codex Mendoza, that was made in present-day Mexico City. It was made for the Spanish viceroy named Mendoza. A viceroy is the effective ruler of a distant colony. By Aztec painters and Spanish scribes who added explanatory texts. It was then sent to Europe and became the sole document for Europeans to study the Aztec people and Central America. Here we turn to the early page, I think it's the first page, that tells of the founding myth of Tenochtitlan, of the city of Tenochtitlan. It's said that an eagle landed on a prickly pear cactus that was growing from a stone, which signaled the importance of this location by realizing a prophecy foretold by the Aztec god Huitzilopochtli. This page also shows us different words, texts, dresses, fashions, and figures, along with the incredible waterways that made Tenochtitlan possible. The city was basically built on a lake, and the technical innovations of using water really astounded the European colonizers. So here too we have a hybrid object, one that comes out of the history of colonization between the Aztecs and the Spanish. With this photograph, we're seeing another result of this quote-unquote European civilizing mission, this time in Africa, more specifically in the kingdom of Benin. The story goes that by 1896, the British had nearly taken over the whole of the Niger Delta on the western coast of Africa. They just had one leader standing in their way, the Oba, or king, of Benin. Present-day Benin is just west of Nigeria. So in 1897, the Rear Admiral Henry Rawson pillaged Benin, destroying Benin City by setting it on fire, along with much of the kingdom's property, and the British set up rule. It's even said that they built a golf course. This photograph documents members of this expedition to Benin City with all the spoils of war and colonization. Notice that it's not just artifacts and works of art. It's also ivory by way of elephant tusks. Colonization also plunders from the natural world. And so after looking at this photograph, it's fitting that we end with a contemporary artist from this area in Africa, specifically the British Nigerian artist Yinka Shonibare. This is his life-size installation called A Scramble for Africa, which references a real meeting that happened in Berlin in 1884-85, just a couple years before the above expedition to Benin City. It's at this conference that the European powers drew up the map of Africa and decided which areas belonged to whom, and began to regulate their colonial trade. If we look at the tabletop itself, Shonobara makes a direct reference to this event. It's really incredible to think about the real-life consequences a few lines drawn on a piece of paper by powerful men in a faraway European city had for a whole continent. Shonobara often uses what's called Dutch wax print, or batik fabric, which itself testifies to a global situation. The pattern comes from Indonesia. It was produced in Manchester and Amsterdam, but since it wasn't popular with the people there, it was exported to Western Africa, and now it's synonymous with that region. I mean, talk about a globalized identity. But Shonobara often tailors this quote-unquote African look with European-style fashion, as if these men divvying up a continent are taking on, or maybe appropriating, a fashion for themselves. Of course, the fact that these 14 figures are headless is also often commented on. Some interpretations have it that these guys just weren't thinking with their heads, or that in their mad scramble for Africa, they had lost their minds. Whatever the case may be, it's a really rich work, this installation, that responds directly to this consequential and often violent point of contact between Europeans and Africans, which continues to inform the way the politics and economies of these two continents, and even the world as a whole, play out today. Seeing this session from the end, it's clear that contact between different cultures can be both productive and creative, but also counterproductive and damaging. I've only shown you 12 examples, but so many others could be had. You may also have noticed another reoccurring theme in this session, that political and economic power plays a huge role in this history and its arts. This will be the topic of our next session, where we're going to see that art, visual culture, and architecture play a big role in representing and even upholding power.